Now, of course, one of the main arguments against the viability of the concept of shadow functions, functions of the unconscious, fifth, sixth, seventh, and eighth slot functions, is that they're not compatible with the normal use of our main stack functions. That, for example, using NI is hardly compatible with using SI, right? That using FE is not compatible with using TE, with that using FI is not compatible with using TI, and so on and so forth. You understand what I mean, you understand the logic, okay? And of course that has been, or at least that used to be, one of the reasons why I tended to be very skeptical of shadow functions, if not outright reject the viability of the shadow functions. Because it seemed to me very compelling. I think it was compelling to my TI function, actually. You know, TI always looks for cleanness, for a cleansing, a purification of concepts. And I thought, okay, is it not better to just get rid of shadow functions? Because how, if you add them, do you manage the whole mess of trying to make NI and SI coexist, FE and TE coexist, FI and TI coexist, and so on? But I think that with our new conception, or with my new conception that I'm trying to present to you and convince you that it is a useful way to look at the world of functions and the world of personality, namely unconscious fantasies at the root of deep type and deep personality, depth psychology of personality, I think there's a way of understanding how there can be shadow functions. Okay, that goes further than what I discussed in yesterday's video, if you have watched that. So if you want to know more about this, you should definitely stick around. Let me just mention that I have a Patreon page that you can join. You can join my Patreon if you would like to support me. It's only a few dollars or euros a month or a year. It's really not that expensive. My patrons often tell me that it is kind of a steal, so you should take advantage. It really, really helps me. It keeps me going in these difficult times. I could not do this work without you, so please consider it, knowing that you have cool perks if you join, namely access to our Discord server. You can come hang out with me and the others, and also access to a whole archive of deep dive videos where I can go into great amount of detail about topics that the patrons usually ask me to cover. NI in mysticism, NI in magic, a new conception of INFPs. There's lots of different deep dive videos that you can access if you become a patron, so please consider it, okay? Thank you guys for bearing with me. And let's return to our shadow functions. So let's take an example. Okay, so NI kind of all about repairing the world in terms of fantasy. SI kind of all about projectively identifying with the world in fantasy, right? So it is in SI's interest to preserve the world, since it identifies with it as its idealized version of itself. Whereas in the case of NI, well, the world is in need of repair, so certainly the status quo is not good. Here you can already sense the seeds of how NI can really motivate one into activism, radicalism, even a revolutionary perspective. Think of Marx, think of Nietzsche, and you can also see how SI contains the seed of a slightly more inertial, balanced, conservative attitude, okay, to the world and to history. Think, for example, of Roger Scruton or Edmund Burke, okay? And so it seems that, you know, this projective identification with the world, desire for preservation of the world, SI that is on the one hand, and then NI repair of the world, mending of the world, which necessitates changing a lot of things about the world, just aren't compatible. And yet, first of all, they both exist in us as fantasies, because they were both emerging fantasies of our very early childhood, okay? It so happens that in the case, for example, of NI dominance, given the particular experience of the child, first in intrauterine life and then later on in the relationship with the mother figure, the child selected an NI fantasy as the main fantasy to help soothe its anxiety in the face of perceived lack of reliability of the mother, for example. Okay? And similarly, the SI child, well, ended up choosing more of an SI fantasy. So I had the choice between two. The two can coexist in the unconscious, but they cannot be activated in the same way so that one of them becomes expressed in consciousness and guides behavior and gives meaning to the world and to our actions. So the NI child shows a preference for an NI fantasy that becomes the constitutive fantasy of the personality. The SI child chooses another one, and the two are not really compatible. So first of all, notice that the fact that the NI fantasy is chosen does not mean that the SI fantasy doesn't exist in the unconscious. It exists in the unconscious, it's there. So if you want, you can call it a shadow function. It's also justified to call it a shadow function because obviously what we do on an everyday basis, we have a vested interest in considering good, and whatever is opposed to that, we have a tendency to denigrate and to berate and to consider less good. So an anti-dominant has a clear, it's also important for matters of cognitive dissonance, or rather avoiding cognitive dissonance. It's important that the anti-dominant values NI, the same way it's important for the TE dominant to value TE, whether they articulate the whole thing in terms of TE or NI is not our main interest here. But avoiding cognitive dissonance requires this valuation. And therefore, by implication, a devaluation of traits that accrue to SI in the case of the NI dominant, NI in the case of the SI dominant, FE in the case of the T dominant, and so on. In that regard, it becomes justified to call them shadow functions because the shadow is precisely that part of our personality which we tend to repress, reject, berate, not want to face. So in a sense, you can understand the SI world, the SI function, in the case of an NI dominant, as that a part of their unconscious that is there, that in fact further integration in the path of individuation would be beneficial to the person because it would reconcile these opposites. Here we can see the Jungian theme of reconciliation of opposites. But at the same time, it's kind of easier on an everyday basis to just repress it. So it's there in the unconscious, but it just doesn't find expression, okay? The fact that it's there in the unconscious means that there might be a possibility for it to become more conscious, even if it's in the shadow, namely an area that is actually kind of deep in the unconscious. The shadow is not in the superficial layers of the unconscious. They're certainly deeper. That's why I say that the shadow functions are built out of ciphers, and so you can't really summon them at will just like that. But these cipher fragments can be likened to shadow functions. And in the next video, we'll be looking a bit more in detail into whether they can in fact manifest in the external reality, external world of people and their types, and what are the modalities of that and what can be done with that. Okay, guys? Before I leave you, don't forget that I've written 2 books on the INFJ personality that if you haven't got them yet, you might be interested. They're all in the spirit of how I think and speak. The Ecstatic Soul is all about the inner life of the INFJ, thoughts, beliefs, consciousness of the INFJ. That's the deepest book on this particular topic. You should definitely get it if you want a deep understanding of the inner INFJ. And for the outer INFJ, definitely have a look at the Infinite Soul, INFJ Life in the Modern World, which is all about the life of INFJs in the world and how they are resilient and how they can manage to find purpose, value, and meaning in a world that often at first seems hostile to them. Those 2 books are available at the links below, guys. Get them if you want a deep understanding of INFJs. And in the meantime, take care, and I will see you tomorrow. Bye-bye.